On the freezing afternoon of January 15, 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 climbed out of New York's LaGuardia Airport. On board were 150 passengers, 5 crew members, and one of the busiest flight corridors in the world beneath their wings. Just 2 minutes after takeoff, disaster struck. At 2,800 feet, a flock of Canada geese slammed into both engines. Explosions, then silence. The Airbus A320 had become a powerless glider over the heart of Manhattan. Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger faced an unthinkable choice. LaGuardia was too far. Teterboro, out of reach. With only seconds left, he aimed for the one flat surface still within reach, the icy waters of the Hudson River. What happened next would be remembered as the miracle on the Hudson. One of the rarest survival stories in modern aviation. But not every water landing ends in triumph. From a hijacked jet plunging into the Indian Ocean, to a small turboprop betrayed by a faulty fuel gauge, to a DC-9 that ran out of fuel after 3 failed landings. Tonight, we uncover 4 incredible stories of jets forced into the sea. Welcome to Sky Investigations, where every wave hides a story. Case number 1, U.S. Airways, Flight 1549, Miracle on the Hudson, January 15, 2009. It was a freezing afternoon in New York City. At LaGuardia Airport, U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320-214, prepared for departure to Charlotte, North Carolina. On board were 150 passengers and 5 crew members. At the controls sat Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger, a 57-year-old veteran pilot with over 19,000 flight hours, and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, on his very first operational flight on the A320 after completing training. The flight was scheduled to last just over 2 hours, but within minutes, it would become one of the most remarkable survival stories in modern aviation. At 3:24 p.m., the A320 lifted off from runway 4 at LaGuardia. Conditions were crisp and clear. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit. With good visibility across the city, controllers instructed the aircraft to climb northbound over the Bronx before turning south along its planned route. Everything inside the cockpit appeared normal, engines stable, instruments reading nominal. For passengers, it was a routine climb out of New York, a smooth ascent, the hum of the engines, the skyline shrinking below. But that calm would last barely 2 minutes. At approximately 3:26 p.m., while passing through 2,800 feet, the aircraft suddenly collided with a flock of large Canada geese. 2 loud thuds reverberated through the fuselage. Flames briefly erupted from the left engine, then silence. Both engines had lost thrust almost simultaneously. The Airbus had become a 70-ton glider over the densest city in America. First Officer Skiles immediately began emergency restart procedures following the engine relight checklist. Captain Sullenberger took control of the aircraft and transmitted to air traffic control. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cactus 1549. We've hit birds. We've lost thrust on both engines. We're returning to LaGuardia." The controller cleared them to return immediately, but Sully's instincts told him they would never make it. Air traffic control offered runway 13 at LaGuardia. Sullenberger checked his altitude, speed, and glide distance. At just over 2,000 feet and descending fast, they were too low. Moments later, controllers suggested Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Sully considered it, then rejected it. The numbers didn't add up. They were out of range. Inside the cockpit, the crew had only seconds to act. The engines remained lifeless. The APU, the auxiliary power unit, was switched on to preserve hydraulic and electrical systems. The aircraft was descending at roughly 1,000 feet per minute. Outside the windshield, the Manhattan skyline filled the horizon. Bridges, buildings, and rivers stretched below. At 3:28 p.m., Captain Sullenberger made his final decision. "We're going to be in the Hudson. From that moment on, every move had to be perfect. Sullenberger maintained airspeed near 200 knots, trimming the nose to prevent a stall. With no thrust, the A320 was essentially gliding silently through the heart of New York City. Below, traffic crossed the George Washington Bridge. The aircraft passed over it by less than 900 feet. In the cabin, flight attendants shouted commands that would soon become famous. Brace, brace, heads down, stay down. Passengers crouched forward, gripping seatbacks. Some prayed. Others stared through the windows as the icy river rushed closer. At 3:31 p.m., 208 seconds after the bird strike, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 hit the water near West 48th Street in Manhattan. The impact was violent yet controlled. The nose pitched upward, the fuselage flexed, and the aircraft skipped across the Hudson River before settling afloat in the freezing current. Inside the cabin, the silence broke into chaos. Water began to seep through the fuselage. Passengers rushed toward the exits as the crew deployed slides and rafts. Many climbed out onto the wings, forming clusters of people standing on the slippery metal surface, surrounded by icy water. Temperatures hovered near freezing, with wind chill below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Sullenberger walked through the cabin twice, ensuring no one was left behind before he himself evacuated. Within minutes, New York commuter ferries, Coast Guard vessels, and police boats converged on the site. Ferry captains diverted from their routes and maneuvered alongside the sinking aircraft. Rescuers began pulling shivering survivors to safety directly from the wings and life rafts. By 3:40 p.m., all 155 souls were off the plane. 4 passengers and 1 flight attendant suffered serious injuries, but there were no fatalities. The image of the A320 floating in the Hudson, surrounded by ferries and rescue boats, quickly became one of the most iconic scenes in aviation history. The press soon called it the Miracle on the Hudson. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an exhaustive investigation documented in Accident Report AAR 1003. Both engines were recovered from the river and examined. Each had ingested multiple Canada geese, causing catastrophic internal damage and complete thrust loss. Investigators conducted simulator tests to determine if the aircraft could have reached LaGuardia or Teterboro. In theory, yes, but only if the pilots had turned back the instant the birds struck. Once human reaction time and realistic decision-making were factored in, every scenario ended in disaster. The ditching, they concluded, was the only survivable choice. The NTSB praised the crew's performance. The flight crew's decision-making and execution during the accident sequence were the most effective possible. Legacy. In the weeks that followed, Captain Sullenberger became a national hero. He testified before Congress, emphasizing the importance of pilot training, quick judgment, and teamwork. The event also renewed attention on bird strike hazards near major airports and prompted new wildlife management programs across the United States. In 2016, the story was dramatized in the film Sully, directed by Clint Eastwood, bringing the event to a global audience. Water landings, or ditchings, are among the most feared scenarios in aviation. Few commercial jets have ever survived such an event without massive loss of life. But on that freezing afternoon in 2009, one Airbus A320 and 155 people defied every statistic. Calm under pressure, precise decision-making, and crew coordination turned near-certain tragedy into survival. That day, the Hudson River became both a runway and a lifeboat, proof that even when engines fail, human skill can keep hope alive. But while the Hudson ended in a miracle, another flight over the Indian Ocean would descend into chaos, not because of nature, but because of the people on board. Case number 2. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961. November 23, 1996. It was a calm Saturday morning in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. At Bole International Airport, passengers boarded Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961, a Boeing 767-260ER registered ETAIZ. The flight was bound for Nairobi, Kenya, with additional stops later that day. On board were 163 passengers and 12 crew members, a total of 175 people. Families, students, and business travelers filled the cabin. Among them were 3 young Ethiopian men carrying no guns, only bottles of liquor and a dangerous plan. Within hours, this flight would become one of the deadliest hijackings in aviation history. Shortly after takeoff, as the jet climbed toward cruising altitude, the 3 men forced their way into the cockpit. They claimed to have bombs and demanded to be flown to Australia. Captain Lolabat, a veteran pilot, immediately understood the impossibility. The distance from Ethiopia to Australia was more than 6,000 miles, far beyond the range of the Boeing 767. He tried to reason with them. The aircraft didn't carry nearly enough fuel, but reason meant nothing. The hijackers were agitated, inexperienced, and desperate. They threatened to destroy the aircraft if he disobeyed. Captain Abate knew he was trapped between obedience and survival, and that time, not distance, would decide the outcome. Under orders, Captain Abate turned east, steering the aircraft over the endless expanse of the Indian Ocean. He knew the flight was doomed if it stayed airborne too long. The jet had been fueled only for its short route to Nairobi, not a transoceanic journey. Hour after hour, he pleaded with the hijackers to allow a refueling stop in the Seychelles. They refused, accusing him of lying. He warned again and again that the fuel was almost gone, but they didn't believe him. In the cabin, tension was suffocating. Passengers prayed quietly. Some wrote goodbye notes. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, trying to keep order amid the fear. After nearly 4 hours of flight, the warning chime in the cockpit sounded. The fuel gauges had hit 0. Moments later, the left engine flamed out. Then, the right. The cabin lights flickered. Silence replaced the steady hum of the turbines. Ethiopian Airlines. Flight 961 had become a powerless glider over open water. The hijackers panicked. Their threats turned to shouting as the captain declared an emergency. Through the cockpit windows, the crew spotted the faint outline of the Comoros Islands, the only hope for survival. Captain Abate announced over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of fuel. Prepare for ditching. Remove your shoes. Do not inflate your life jackets inside the aircraft." Despite the chaos, his tone remained calm. Every decision in the next minutes would determine who lived and who didn't. At approximately 12:30 p.m., beachgoers on the island of Grande Comore saw the giant Boeing descending silently over turquoise water. Both engines were dead. The jet was gliding low, wings level, aiming for a controlled ditching parallel to the shore. But inside the cockpit, control slipped away. In a last act of panic, one hijacker lunged at the yoke, wrenching the aircraft to the right. The wing dropped. Seconds later, the Boeing 767 hit the Indian Ocean. The right wing struck first, snapping off and sending the fuselage cartwheeling across the waves. The aircraft broke apart in full view of onlookers on the beach. Inside, the destruction was immediate. Water flooded through torn fuselage sections. Passengers screamed. Those who had inflated their life jackets inside were pinned against the ceiling by rising water, unable to dive down to escape. Others fought free, clawing through debris and fuel toward openings in the wreckage. Survivors described the sensation of cold water, darkness, and chaos, swimming toward sunlight that seemed impossibly far away. Local fishermen and villagers rushed to the scene in small boats, pulling survivors from the wreckage. Helicopters arrived soon after. Out of 175 people on board, only 50 survived. 125 were killed, including all 3 hijackers. One survivor later recalled, "Water poured in, people were screaming. I unbuckled and swam toward the light. When I reached the surface, the plane was in pieces. Another survivor remembered the critical safety error. Those who inflated their vests inside couldn't get out. They were trapped. The ones who waited until they were outside survived. From the beach, rescuers watched in horror as survivors floated among wreckage so close to land, yet many never made it ashore. The Ethiopian Civil Aviation Authority, assisted by international agencies, led the inquiry. Investigators concluded the direct cause was the hijackers' refusal to allow diversion for fuel. Both engines failed after nearly 4 hours of flight due to fuel exhaustion. During the ditching, interference from a hijacker caused the right wing to strike first, breaking the aircraft apart. The report emphasized the deadly consequence of inflating life jackets inside the cabin, a mistake that claimed many lives. Images of the shattered aircraft floating just offshore shocked the world. News outlets called it one of the deadliest hijackings in aviation history. Experts highlighted the hijackers' ignorance. No Boeing 767 could fly from Ethiopia to Australia non-stop. The U.S. State Department condemned the act as terrorism. Security agencies across the world began re-examining cockpit protection years before the post-September 11th reforms. Captain Lolabadi was hailed as a hero for his calm under unimaginable pressure. Though devastated by the loss of life, his composure saved 50 souls. The tragedy reshaped airline safety briefings worldwide. After this crash, airlines began emphasizing one crucial line: do not inflate your life jacket until you are outside the aircraft. That single instruction has since saved countless lives. What began as a peaceful morning flight from Addis Ababa ended in chaos and heartbreak over the Indian Ocean. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 remains one of the most haunting cases in aviation history. A collision of fear, ignorance, and courage. 50 survived because of one captain's refusal to surrender to panic. 125 did not. In the end, this flight stands as a somber lesson. Sometimes the deadliest forces in aviation are not mechanical, but human. And even in the face of madness, professionalism can still make the difference between life and death. The Comoros crash proved how hijackers can doom a jet. But sometimes disaster comes from within the aircraft itself. A tiny maintenance mistake that turned deadly over the Mediterranean. Case number 3. Tune-inner Flight 1153, August 6, 2005. The midday sun blazed over the Adriatic coast as passengers boarded Tune-inner Flight 1153 at Bari's Police Airport in southern Italy. The short regional flight was bound for Djerba, a resort island off Tunisia, popular with tourists. The aircraft, an ATR 72-202 twin turboprop, carried 35 passengers and 4 crew members. At the controls were Captain Chafik Alawini and First Officer Ali Chelli, both experienced Tunisian pilots. They expected an easy, uneventful journey across the Mediterranean. But less than an hour later, their aircraft would be floating in the sea off Sicily, broken apart by one of the most avoidable maintenance errors in aviation history. At 1:32 p.m., Flight 1153 lifted off smoothly from runway 7 at Bari. The ATR climbed toward its cruising altitude, engines humming steadily. Passengers relaxed, watching the coastline fade into the shimmering blue of the Mediterranean below. Everything appeared normal. The aircraft leveled off. The crew began routine checks, and air traffic control cleared them on course toward Tunisian airspace. But beneath the cockpit displays, a silent problem hid in plain sight. The fuel quantity indicator, the instrument showing how much fuel remained, was lying. At 2:37 p.m., an alarm sounded in the cockpit. The right engine's pressure began to drop. Captain Alawini and First Officer Chelli scanned their instruments, looking for a cause. Seconds later, the right engine flamed out completely. The captain attempted a restart, switching fuel pumps and adjusting mixture, but then the left engine failed too. The cockpit fell silent. Both engines were dead. Tuninter Flight 1153 had become a powerless glider over the open sea. Captain Alowini transmitted a distress call. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Tuninter 1153. Both engines were lost. Controllers in Palermo, Sicily responded immediately, vectoring the aircraft toward land. But calculations were grim. At their current altitude, the ATR would never reach Sicily. The crew's only remaining option was to ditch at sea. In the cabin, the sudden silence terrified passengers. The familiar hum of engines had vanished. Flight attendants moved quickly, shouting instructions to brace for impact. Some passengers prayed, others cried quietly as the aircraft began its slow descent. In the cockpit, the crew focused on maintaining glide speed, 120 knots, to keep the aircraft controllable. The captain knew that even a slight stall could send them tumbling into the sea. Palermo was out of reach. There was no choice left but to attempt a water landing. At 3:23 p.m., after nearly 50 minutes without power, the ATR-72 hit the waves about 18 miles north of the Sicilian coast. The impact was violent. The aircraft's belly struck the water, then broke apart as the tail snapped off. Passengers and debris were thrown into the sea. Some managed to climb onto floating wreckage. Others inflated life vests and clung to pieces of the shattered fuselage. Within minutes, Italian rescue helicopters and Coast Guard boats arrived, guided by emergency beacons and visual sightings from nearby vessels. Rescuers pulled survivors from the water one by one. Out of 39 people on board, 23 survived. 16 were killed. Italy's Agenzia Nazionale per la Sicurezza del Volo, ANSV, the National Flight Safety Agency, launched an immediate investigation. What they discovered shocked investigators. There had been no fuel leak, no refueling error, and no weather problem. Instead, the ATR-72 had been flying with the wrong fuel gauge installed. During maintenance days earlier, technicians had mistakenly fitted a fuel quantity indicator from an ATR-42, a smaller version of the aircraft with smaller fuel tanks. The incorrect gauge made the pilots believe they had far more fuel than they actually did. In reality, the tanks were nearly dry. The aircraft ran out of fuel mid-flight and both engines stopped. The ANSV concluded that the gauge mismatch, a single component error, had caused the crash. The final report placed blame across multiple layers. Maintenance personnel who installed the incorrect gauge, Tuninter management for failing to detect the error during post-maintenance checks, ATR, the manufacturer, for not designing safeguards to prevent part interchange between similar aircraft. Italian courts went further. In 2009, several Tuninter executives and mechanics were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison, a rare outcome in civil aviation. The verdict sent a clear message to the global aviation community. Even a tiny maintenance mistake can carry criminal consequences when lives are lost. Survivors described the ditching as a nightmare of noise, impact, and freezing water. One passenger recalled, "When we hit, everything shattered. Water rushed in. I thought I was going to die. Somehow I got out and held onto a piece of the wing until a helicopter found me." Another survivor remembered watching rescuers arrive. "They pulled us out one by one. Without them, we wouldn't have survived." Despite the chaos, many credited the crew for their skill. Captain Alowini managed to bring the aircraft down relatively flat on the water, preventing it from cartwheeling or disintegrating on impact, a maneuver that saved more than half of those on board. Tuninter Flight 1153 was not brought down by bad weather or sabotage, but by a number, a false reading on a single instrument. A simple maintenance oversight turned a routine flight into a fight for survival. For 16 people, that mistake proved fatal. For 23 others, survival was a testament to composure, crew skill, and swift rescue. The crash forced manufacturers and maintenance organizations worldwide to re-examine procedures for part compatibility and labeling. Today, Tuniner Flight 1153 stands as a chilling reminder. In aviation, precision is everything. A single mismatched component can decide the fate of an entire aircraft and everyone on board. Yet even when no hijackers and no faulty parts are involved, danger still lurks. Poor decisions in the cockpit would push another jet, years earlier, into the Sea of the Caribbean. Case number 4. ALM Antillean Airlines. Flight 980, 1970, Caribbean Sea. May 2, 1970. At John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, passengers boarded ALM Antillean Airlines Flight 980, a Douglas DC 9-33CF operated by Overseas National Airways, or ONA, on behalf of ALM. On board were 57 passengers and 6 crew members, 63 souls in total. Most were Caribbean travelers returning home, along with vacationers headed for sunshine and sea. Their destination was St. Martin, a tropical island known for its short runway and breathtaking beachside landings. But that day, the flight would never reach its destination. Instead, it would end in the Caribbean Sea, just miles from safety. The DC-9 departed New York without incident and headed south over the Atlantic. Several hours later, as it neared St. Martin, the crew received troubling weather reports. Heavy rain showers, low clouds, and poor visibility blanketed the island. Captain Lucille May and her crew began an approach to Princess Juliana International Airport. Known for its famously short runway, less than 7,500 feet long, the airport was already challenging in perfect conditions. Now, driving rain and turbulence made the approach even more dangerous. The crew tried once, then again, and again. 3 separate approaches, each ending the same way. The runway vanished behind a curtain of rain, forcing a go-around. Each missed attempt cost precious fuel. After the 3rd missed approach, the crew decided to divert. Their first option, St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Air traffic control approved immediately, but St. Thomas was over 100 miles away, and by now, the DC-9's remaining fuel was critically low. The captain then considered St. Croix, even farther south, but the aircraft had already been circling for nearly 40 minutes. Every turn, every go-around drained more fuel. Inside the cabin, passengers grew restless. They could feel the aircraft circling, hear the engines straining. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, reassuring passengers that they would soon be on the ground. But the truth in the cockpit was grim. The fuel gauges were nearing zero. Minutes later, the first warning light illuminated. Then, another. The fuel pressure dropped in both engines. At 3:49 p.m., the left engine flamed out. Moments later, the right engine followed. The DC-9 fell silent, its turbofan engines reduced to mere windmills. ALM Antillean Airlines Flight 980 had become a glider, descending over the open Caribbean with no land in sight. The captain called Mayday to San Juan Center. Mayday, 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 ALM 980, both engines out, attempting ditching. There was no time left for calculation or hesitation. The only option was to put the jet down on water, as close to rescue as possible. Roughly 30 miles southeast of St. Croix, the blue sea below transformed from destination to final runway. The captain leveled the aircraft and lowered the nose slightly to control descent speed. Passengers were told to brace. Seconds later, the DC-9 slammed into the ocean. The impact was violent. The fuselage broke apart. Water poured in through ruptured seams. Many passengers were thrown forward by the force, others into the sea. Those who remained conscious fought to escape. Some inflated their life vests and climbed onto floating debris. Others clung to seat cushions. Within minutes, U.S. Coast Guard helicopters and rescue boats, all ready en route from distress signals, reached the site. Rescuers pulled dozens from the water. Some were injured and in shock, but alive. Out of 63 people aboard, 40 survived. 23 perished in the crash and its aftermath. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an investigation, releasing its findings in 1971 as Aircraft Accident Report AAR 71-08. Investigators found no mechanical faults, no weather-induced failures, only human error and poor planning. The report concluded that fuel management was inadequate throughout the flight. Repeated missed approaches consumed critical reserves. The crew misjudged consumption rates and delayed diversion far too long. Possible discrepancies between the fuel indicators and actual fuel levels may have contributed to the confusion. The NTSB stated that once the third missed approach failed, diversion should have been immediate. Instead, hesitation and optimism bias, the belief that one more try would succeed, left the aircraft with no options. The board also criticized both ALM and ONA for insufficient oversight of fuel planning and operational decision-making. Survivors later described the terrifying moments of impact. One recalled, "The plane just hit the water and everything broke apart. I was underwater, fighting to get out. When I surfaced, all I saw were people screaming, wreckage floating everywhere." Another spoke of the rescue. "We clung to seat cushions until the Coast Guard came. I thought I wouldn't make it. When they pulled me up, I felt like I had been reborn." The tragedy was compounded by how close they had been to safety. Just minutes separated survival from disaster. Despite the loss of 23 lives, the ditching of ALM Flight 980 is remembered as a partial triumph of airmanship. 40 people survived, thanks to the crew's calm handling of a powerless jet over open water and the rapid response of the U.S. Coast Guard. The tragedy also became a pivotal case in aviation fuel management training. Airlines around the world began reinforcing stricter diversion protocols and minimum fuel policies. The lesson was stark and simple. Fuel is life. ALM Antillean Airlines. Flight 980 was doomed not by weather or mechanical failure, but by hesitation and miscalculation. Each missed approach consumed precious fuel until none remained. In the final minutes, the Caribbean Sea became both runway and grave. For 40 survivors, it was a miracle of endurance and rescue. For 23 others, it was the end of a journey meant for paradise. Today, Flight 980 stands as a sobering reminder. In aviation, every drop counts and every decision matters. Looking at these four cases side by side, we see very different outcomes, but also striking similarities. U.S. Airways. Flight 1549 showed what flawless training and composure can achieve. With both engines gone just after takeoff, Captain Sullenberger and his crew turned a powerless jet into a glider and made the Hudson River their runway. It became known as the Miracle on the Hudson. Every life was saved, but Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 revealed the darker side of human factors. When fear and conflict inside the cockpit overpower skill and logic, a hijacking forced the crew into an impossible situation. Fuel starvation was inevitable, and interference in the final seconds sent the aircraft tumbling apart. 125 people were lost. Tuniner Flight 1153 exposed the hidden danger of technical oversight. A single wrong fuel gauge installed from a smaller aircraft fooled the pilots into believing they had enough fuel. Both engines quit mid-flight. The crew's controlled ditching saved 23 lives, but 16 passengers never made it home. A tragedy born from preventable human error. And ALM Flight 980 illustrated how hesitation can be just as deadly as malfunction. 3 missed landings in a tropical storm burned through critical reserves. When the crew finally diverted, it was too late. The DC-9 ran out of fuel and ditched in the Caribbean Sea, killing 23. Across these 4 very different disasters, 3 shared a common cause: fuel exhaustion. In the Comoros over the Mediterranean and in the Caribbean, empty tanks turned aircraft into gliders. Each showed how fragile flight becomes when fuel planning, monitoring, and verification fail, whether through error, distraction, or indecision. But there's another thread: decision-making under pressure. In New York, Captain Sullenberger had only seconds to act, yet his judgment was flawless. In the Comoros, hijackers stripped that decision-making away. In Sicily and the Caribbean, hesitation and false assumptions proved just as deadly as sabotage. Finally, survivability depended not only on pilots, but on response. The Hudson River was lined with ferries ready within minutes. In the Comoros and the Mediterranean, rescue was slower, scattered, and costly. Those few minutes between impact and arrival decided who lived and who didn't. Together, these 4 cases changed aviation. They forced airlines and regulators to confront hard truths: that every gauge must be right, every pound of fuel verified, and every decision made before hesitation sets in. From the icy Hudson to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, these flights proved one unshakable law of the sky. In an emergency, every second and every decision matters. From these 4 water landings, aviation learned critical lessons that continue to shape safety today. Lesson 1. Fuel is life. Whether through miscalculation, faulty instruments, or hijacker interference, fuel exhaustion was central to 3 of these accidents. Regulations now require stricter reserve margins and more rigorous verification of fuel loads. Pilots are trained to cross-check gauges against actual uplifted fuel and consumption. Running out of fuel in the air is never acceptable, but these tragedies show it can still happen if oversight fails. Lesson 2. Preparation saves lives. The miracle on the Hudson proved the value of crew resource management and emergency training. Calm, coordinated decision-making transformed a potential catastrophe into a survival story. Conversely, Ethiopian 961 revealed how panic and misunderstanding, such as passengers inflating life jackets inside the cabin, can turn survivable accidents into mass fatalities. Today, flight attendants stress safety briefings, and ditching procedures are taken more seriously. Lesson 3. External threats are unpredictable. Each case stemmed from a very different cause: birds, hijackers, maintenance error, and poor planning. Aviation safety isn't about eliminating one risk, it's about building resilience against all of them. That means robust security, strict maintenance protocols, wildlife management near airports, and constant pilot training for the unexpected. Ultimately, these lessons remind us that aviation safety is never finished. Every flight depends on fuel management, crew preparation, and the ability to adapt when the unthinkable happens. Each story asks the same haunting question: when the engines fall silent and land is out of reach, what decides who lives and who dies? Sometimes it's the crew's skill, sometimes the speed of rescue, and sometimes pure chance. For survivors, these moments defined the rest of their lives. For aviation, they became lessons written in blood and water. Because when an aircraft runs out of options, the sea becomes the last runway. And survival, in the end, depends on seconds, skill, and fate. If you want to uncover more hidden lessons from aviation history, subscribe to Sky Investigations.